the radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome. Welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Monday evening. Another beautiful night on a tropical island in Puerto Rico. I can't complain. I don't know if Steve is in the East Coast or West Coast, that he might have some snow under his feet. But yeah, today we're going to be talking about discrimination, sexual harassment, all the issues related to that. We'll link it up to free speech and what's going on the internet and any other issues. Of course, you can chime in with Super Chat questions. Super Chat is open, and the more dollars you put on the Super Chat question, the more likely it is it'll be answered. So take that into account. All right, we have Steve with us, Steve Simpson. I should have brought up a bio, but I don't have a bio. So Steve was a colleague of mine at the Andrian Institute for many years. I'm not sure how many years, but a few years.
5 years. So
5 years. For 5 years.
Maybe a little, yeah.
I think he joined the Andrian Institute from the Institute for Justice, which is a fantastic organization. I encourage you all to look it up. And today is at the Pacific Legal Foundation, which does similar work to the Institute for Justice, and another fantastic organization. But you said you're in Virginia, but isn't Pacific Legal Foundation based in California?
Yeah, we're all over the place. We're a national organization. The organization started in the 1970s during the Reagan administration, not presidential administration, but governor, when Reagan was governor, right around that time period. And so Pacific Legal is actually the oldest pro-freedom civil liberties organization in the country. We basically started the whole thing. So started in California, was in California for many years, and then spread. So we're national today. We have an office in the DC area, which is where I work out of. We have an office in Florida and then Sacramento. We got people all over the country. So yeah.
That's great. You guys do great work here. And of course, in IJ, they're both fantastic institutions. So today's show is sponsored by Matt, who asked to have a show on discrimination and how it's treated in the law, how it's treated in kind of the corporate setting, and kind of what would be an objectivist, if you will, analysis of this. And Matt suggested I bring on Steve, and I thought that was a great suggestion. So Steve's been on the show before. It's been a while though. I have been on the show. I was on the show way back when I was at ARI, right? Yeah, just 3-4 years now.
It was the radio show back then, I think. I don't even know if it was but maybe we did it. I don't remember. But yeah, no, that was a while back. In fact, we talked about the Obergefell decision, which we could even talk about today because it's kind of related to that's the gay marriage decision. So
that's right. That's right. Okay, so let's jump in, talk about discrimination. So let's start with, what is discrimination? What does discrimination even mean? As a concept, as an idea.
Yeah, actually, let me say one thing I should have said before, sure. Which is I'm here for myself, not for PLF. I just want to make that clear to people. I work at PLF. I have my own views. Everybody at PLF doesn't necessarily share my views. So with that disclaimer, anyway, we can jump in. So yeah, it's good that you raised the question, what is discrimination? Because it's got a legal meaning, and it's the meaning that I think a lot of people think about it in terms of anti-discrimination law. And we can talk a bit about that, but it's got a normal sort of just objective meaning, quite apart from that. Most people think of discrimination as a bad thing.
Yeah.
It's not a bad thing. It's a neutral concept, and it's a necessary thing. We have to discriminate. We have to make decisions. We have to, we have to exercise our values. We have to think constantly. We should discriminate often. Discrimination is a good thing in many, many contexts. Question is, what are the grounds or the reasons that we are discriminating or making decisions about whom we should associate with, about all kinds of things, what kind of food we should eat, what should a job should I take, et cetera. So there's a lot packed into that. But one of the really important things for people to get is that discrimination is not a dirty word. And it is really unfortunate that modern views of discrimination just hold that any form of discrimination is necessarily bad or it's tainted in some way. And even the forms of discrimination that are outlawed are often entirely rational, proper behaviors. And we can talk a bit about that because anti-discrimination law is gigantic. And I mean, I could go into, I don't want to, blabber on too long, Yaron, but I could talk a bit about, how it's thought about in the legal realm and kind of what it means to even think about or talk about anti-discrimination law.
Sure, we should definitely, I mean, that's the next, I guess, next point we should make. I'll just say yes. I mean, discrimination. I mean, we discriminate every day. We discriminate between restaurants. We discriminate between the values that we have. You can't do everything, and you shouldn't do everything because you should have a hierarchy of what's important to you, what's not. And if you're rational,
you discriminate rationally, and if you're irrational, you discriminate irrationally based on the wrong hierarchy of values, based on irrelevant aspects, irrelevant criteria. And we'll get back to kind of irrational discrimination, I guess, once we talk about the context for discrimination law. So tell us a little bit about discrimination law. And also, I'm curious, is it just something that started in the 1960s? Was there any kind of discrimination law before that, or is it really a feature of the Civil Rights Act?
No, not really, although there's a number of points. So, I mean, the statutes, that is the 64 Civil Rights Act is the sort of seminal big anti-discrimination statute passed in 1964, obviously. And that comes at the tail end of the whole civil rights period and the battles against Jim Crow, which I would sum it up as efforts to end, legitimate efforts, good efforts, to end state-sponsored, state-sanctioned, state-enforced racism. I mean, it's probably better just to use the term racism because that's what where this whole idea of discrimination law, where it really evolves from. So its origins are entirely proper in the sense that it is proper to excise or purge from government any distinctions on the basis of race and many other kinds of distinctions. And think about it in a positive way. The positive principle is equality before the law, and which is a necessary component of the rule of law. You can't have a rule of law that applies to people based on non-essential characteristics or based on non-essential things that the law shouldn't take into consideration. So if the goal of the law is to protect rights, you can't say, and the law can't just protect the rights of white people and not black people, which is in fact what we had in this country for a long, long time, and not just in slavery, but in like so many of the policies and so much else that happened in the South. You had de jure slavery and then segregation. And then after that, it was de facto in a certain way that they managed to keep it going for many, many years. And that kind of culminates in the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s, and all of the battles over civil rights. But the 64 Act, the statute that you referred to, and there are also analogous state laws, it's not really the first thing. The first thing to think about, I think, or the first legal measure taken to ban, let's call it state-sponsored racism or just improper, irrational discrimination by government, is the 14th Amendment. So that's the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Right after the Civil War, you get the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment, well, the 15th Amendment says essentially equality in voting rights. The 14th Amendment is integral and really, really important because what that does is it essentially says that everybody in the nation in America is an American citizen and has the rights of an American, not the rights of a citizen of Mississippi or Georgia or Alabama or even Maine or anywhere else. It's, as an American, you are entitled to all the rights that any American has, in particular the rights that are protected by the Bill of Rights. And I would argue that this concept goes back to, and I think the framers of the 14th Amendment were aware of this. This goes all the way back to the Declaration of Independence, so that, you know, you can think about the Bill of Rights as, well, it protects certain rights, and then you have the Ninth Amendment that's supposed to make sure that it protects a whole panoply of rights. But I think the intellectual statement is really contained in the Declaration of Independence, which is, you know, government is instituted among men to protect rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that covers like the whole ball of wax. That covers all of the rights that individual human beings are entitled to as human beings. And the equal protection component of the 14th Amendment, really, so the 14th Amendment does really three things. It says states can't deprive you of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, without equal protection of the laws, and violate what are known as the privileges and immunities of citizenship, which is another way of thinking about what rights are. We can get into why it says privileges and immunities, but it's basically rights. So really three absolutely crucial components to the rule of law and to what it means to be an American, or just a rule of law system, but I think certainly integral to, you know, the American system. So that's really the first.
Jim Crow. Why wasn't Jim Crow? Why wasn't the 14th Amendment used against Jim Crow laws, if that's the case, earlier than the 1960s?
It was, but it was a spotty. I mean, there's a couple reasons for this. First of all, what the 14th Amendment talks about is state action, right? So basically, the states can't, qua states, discriminate against individuals or, you know, in any way deny people the equal protection of the laws, right? So the states as governments can't, you know, pass racist laws, let's say. So the states, the southern states were creative in a horribly evil way, right? So they knew, okay, so we'll abolish all of the laws that are on the books that, you know, openly discriminate or openly violate the rights of Black people. And then what you have is a period of efforts by the states to sidestep the 14th Amendment by essentially allowing state actors, the local sheriff, or maybe I should just put it this way. What you have is a period of time in which state government officials are engaging in racism. And really, I mean, they're lynching people. Let's just like flat out, these guys are members of the Klan, right? And so they're using their state office in a way that is still, it's a difficult issue because they're in the kind of this gray area. It's not strictly speaking the state operating or a government acting. It's individual government officials engaging in all sorts of racist behavior and the violation of the rights of freed slaves and Black people, but they're not really doing it in a quote official capacity. So it's a difficult issue that has to be sorted out and litigated for a long time. What counts as state action, and what do you do when the local sheriff comes to your door and he knocks on the door and he says you have to come outside? Oops, and then he runs away and a bunch of Klansmen grab you and, you know, hang you from a tree. Now, is that really the state acting? It's not really the state acting, but it's somebody acting in sort of the capacity of a state actor. And so what you get is this idea of, or in I forget exactly when it was passed. I think it's like late 19th century Civil Rights Act that seeks to deal with this by essentially saying, and this is a law called now 42 USC section 1983. And what that basically says is individuals have a cause of action against officials that are acting under color of state law. That is, they're not acting with the explicit sanction of the government, but it's kind of a wink and a nod, and now you can sue them. So this took many, many decades to get sorted out. And there's a whole lot we can talk about, but the bottom line is they found ways around it, and there was reluctance on the part of the courts and the federal government to sort of trample, you know, it's not necessary. It's partly states' rights, but it's partly really just, I think, exhaustion with, we had a civil war. We don't want to go back there. We don't want to start another civil war. So there's a period of time from like the end of the Civil War up through the 1960s in which these issues are being fought and battled in court, in riots, in all kinds of things.
Years, 100 years.
I'll just stop talking with this one last point. We can develop it more. Slavery and race issues is one of the hardest issues, if not the hardest issue that this country has ever dealt with. I mean, really, in the post-revolution period, it ranks up there with the hardest things that America has ever dealt with. And it's not an easy thing to solve. How do you deal with that as how does the federal government, how does any government deal with that? How does a society deal with it? It's hard. And that's why it took a long time, because it is really, really hard.
Although, again, you'd think that, you'd think that with the 14th Amendment, it would be, it wasn't just sheriffs doing that, but it was juries being packed. It was a pattern throughout the South. I think part of the problem was there was just no energy around solving the problem. And I think there were racists in the North. And if you look at presidents like Wilson and even FDR, arguably, I mean, they were racist themselves. There was no motivation to really solve the problem until the 1960s.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. But the 14th Amendment, what it would have taken is more than just the 14th Amendment. It would have taken more. Congress should have passed laws then that essentially said, and they could easily have done this because it would have gone after actual state action, that is the jury issues. And I mean, they are a little bit difficult to get to, but Congress could have, I think, done more in that period. And you're right that I think a lot of it had to do with, a lack of desire because there was racism. Although I do think in the early kind of decades after the Civil War, there was a real exhaustion with, we don't want to deal with this anymore. But yeah,
600,000 people died. So
yeah. And also, I mean, racism was part of certainly the fabric of the South, and it was prevalent throughout the entire country. And there was a lot of private discrimination and blurring lines between state action or state discrimination and private discrimination. It is a hard issue to solve. I don't mean to excuse anybody when I say that. I just want to say, you're talking about uprooting in this country, many decades old tendencies, beliefs, views of many millions of people. That takes time to get rid of and to figure out how to solve. So that's not to condone it. It's just to say it's a hard problem.
So in 1964, we get the Civil Rights Act, and certainly a portion of it, as you say, is completely legitimate. It basically reasserts the rule of law. It gets rid of Jim Crow finally. It clarifies, at least to a large extent, many of these issues, and really has a profound impact, I think, on the country, because it really outlaws state discrimination in a way that is clarifying. But it also includes provisions that have to do with private discrimination. Yeah. So tell us what those are and why they were included, and after that we can talk about consequences and effects that they have had.
There's a lot of provisions or titles in the 64 Civil Rights Act. The ones that are really relevant here are essentially, so you talked about the first one, which is doing away with state-sponsored segregation, and other things. So state-sponsored discrimination. But it also dealt with private discrimination in two of the primary categories are employment and what's known as public accommodations. So employment is essentially anytime you employ somebody, even as a private actor, as a private company, you can't discriminate on the basis of, and the list grows longer all the time, but and this is one of the problems with trying to outlaw private discrimination. Yep. But it started out with, so it's race, sex, national origin, religion is in there. I don't know exactly when all these categories came in, but the original ones I think were race, obviously, and I think also discrimination based on sex. And then so that's employment, and everybody understands what employment is. Public accommodations basically is just, you can think of it as a public-facing business. In other words, a business that admits or invites the public in, a store, a hotel, that's what is known as a public accommodation. And so you can't discriminate against your customers. You can't discriminate against the people in the manner in which you provide the services or that a business provides. Those are the main categories, and that also includes education and others. And those are the two categories that cover most of what we think of as private discrimination law that prevents discrimination in private businesses and private conduct. So those are the two categories. Now, I think you asked one other question, but I can't remember what it was right now. But
what motivated that? So,
yeah.
I mean, I think Barry Goldwater was opposed to that part of the Civil Rights Act. Ayn Rand was certainly opposed to that part of the Civil Rights Act, and I'm sure there were others who were opposed to it for a variety of good and bad reasons.
Yes.
But so, what drove the Senate and the House and to include that in the bill?
I mean, what drove it historically is that I think, and I'm interested in your views on this too, because I don't know a giant amount about the history here. So there's different things that drove this. One was that throughout the South, you just had, there was widespread racism in private conduct. I mean, the South continued to, I should say the South, but I mean, businesses throughout the South, private individuals through the South continued to be racists. And I mean, there are a couple of famous cases that we can talk about, but the probably the image that strikes a chord with most people and that most people think about is segregated lunch counters and restaurants that basically just won't allow Black people to enter and use businesses. So even after after Brown versus Board of Education, which is the case that desegregates schools, it essentially says that states cannot in public education allow discrimination in the schools, that's 1954. And so for a period after that, what you get is all of the private businesses throughout the South then saying, okay, well, we'll just, not allow Black people in our businesses, not rent to Black people, have segregated neighborhoods and the like. So I think part of what drove the 64 Civil Rights Act in enacting those bans on private discrimination was the view that if we don't uproot all of this, if we don't get rid of this practice, even in private channels and private behavior, we're never going to get rid of segregation throughout the South. So they thought of it as there was de jure segregation, which was legally enforced, and this is de facto segregation. If we don't uproot that, we're not going to get rid of it. Now, I also think, although I'm not positive about this, but I also think, bad ideas about the proper role of government, collectivism, let's say egalitarianism, probably it's the 1960s. You have a lot of other, very, very bad ideas lingering or becoming more pronounced in the culture. But these ideas had been around since the progressive era, at least, which is essentially collectivism and it's essentially egalitarianism. I have to believe that was driving some of this as well. But I'm not entirely sure of that. So,
I mean, one of the things that surprised me, I guess I only discovered this last year, was, they talk about banks redlining and not giving loans and everything. And I always assumed that was private discrimination, I guess, because it was always discussed in that way. It was banks doing it, right? They were the evil guys. But when you actually read the history, this was state discrimination. This was the state redlining. It was state, government through HUD and through all the other agencies. Of course, this is what happens when the government gets involved in economics, right? It was deciding who should get a mortgage where, who they would insure. And they were the ones who instituted these racial red lines and that would not allow Blacks into certain neighborhoods. And the banks just followed along because they relied on Freddie and Fannie and HUD and everybody else to kind of insure and reduce the risk of the mortgages. So it's fascinating how private discrimination follows state discrimination.
Yeah, no question about it. And in this case, though, I think, it may be that the law, I don't think the law actually required redlining itself. I think what the law did, but this is a good example of why regulation leads to these kinds of bad consequences. There are plenty of laws on the books, both at the state and the federal level, that condoned or were just flat out racist. There were laws in the 20s in some states that basically said that Black people couldn't own homes in white neighborhoods. Now, there were state laws, not federal laws. Yeah. But the law that you're talking about, I'm pretty sure what it was, although I might be wrong about this, but I know a component of it was that the federal government wouldn't insure mortgages if they were in economically depressed or bad parts of town. And as a result, the banks they were like, okay, well, we know where the bad parts of town are, and we know where the good parts of town are. And if we're not going to be able to have an insured mortgage, we're going to draw a red line and say, loan in these. And that the redlining was actually part of the federal government actually drew the lines.
Yeah, the federal government drew the line.
It was the white versus the Black neighborhood. So now, whether that was explicitly an effort at segregation or just an effort at trying to distinguish between what loans the government was going to insure versus not.
There's some evidence that they didn't circle the poor white neighborhoods.
Yeah. It's entirely believable. Believe me, I'm not saying that it was otherwise. What I'm saying is, whether it's explicitly racist or not, like, regulation is a bad idea. It always leads to bad consequences.
Yes, absolutely. And the more the government intervenes, the more of these kind of issues come up, right? So let's take, let's take 64. So now we've outlawed private discrimination, at least in hiring and in public businesses. And so the argument is, there's a lot of people who make the argument, and it has some credibility, that this succeeded, right? In the sense that, if you go to Atlanta, you go to Charlotte, you don't, at least to the outsider, they seem pretty, unsegregated. There's a lot of, people don't explicitly express racist beliefs. They, people interact. They're in, and it seems like racism in the South generally has declined dramatically over the last 50 years, and a lot of people attribute that to the anti-discrimination laws. So could we say that they maybe have some bad impacts, but they also succeeded?
I don't know. I'm skeptical that they did, but it's hard to say, and I don't have real strong views about whether you could say that they succeeded. What I would say is that I think as a general matter, laws that ban private discrimination, they lead to all kinds of bad consequences. One of them is, or at least the set of laws that, because I think you have to think about affirmative action and the fact that Rand wrote about this in Racism, the essay Racism, that when you try to outlaw private discrimination, it inevitably leads to quotas, because it's the only rational way for a business to make sense of these laws and to figure out, okay, look, if I'm going to get sued by the federal government or a private party, I have to bend over backwards to make sure there is no hint of any discrimination whatsoever. And the only sensible way to do that is to have some kind of a quota, or ultimately it leads to a quota. And once you go down that road, now you're creating reasons for both people to have to constantly think about race and be race conscious. And also you're creating all kinds of reasons for tribalism and group conflict, because it always looks like you're favoring one group, or the law or your employer is favoring one group. And that just breeds resentment. And I think over time that actually has had a negative impact. In other words, I think it's caused a sort of resurgence of racism, although there's much more to that.
Yeah, in a sense, it took racism underground, right? So they couldn't put the "no blacks allowed" on the windows, so they took it underground. I think, but I do think the elimination of state racism didn't, it took away the sanction.
Yeah.
And I think with younger generations and over time, it had a huge positive impact. And I'm speculating, but I think that positive impact would have happened even stronger if they hadn't done away with private discrimination.
Yeah.
So over the years, we get quotas, we get affirmative action in a sense, which they deny as quotas, but we get affirmative action. And then we start seeing an expansion of these anti-discrimination laws for sexual orientation, now transgender, and it just goes on and on and on. is that inevitable in the law once you set this in motion? How does the Supreme Court explain this when they rule about these things?
Well, yeah, I think it's inevitable in the law, and it comes way before the Supreme Court ever gets to. But the two things, so quotas and expanding the number of groups that will ultimately be, quote, protected by these laws, that's inevitable, and it's inevitable for, I don't know, pretty simple reasons, and you can think about it as maybe as like pressure group warfare is one way to think about it, which is an inevitable consequence of the mixed economy. And one, sort of simple, if not, it's not simplistic, maybe it's a bit oversimplified, is if one group gets special protections, another group is going to come along and say, I want special protections too. I mean, it's just as simple as that. And it at a certain point, and Rand made this point in many, many places, that if you are under a mixed economy, people's interests necessarily conflict in a way that they would never conflict in a free society. And what you get is a race to lobby, politicians to be protected at first, and then for special favors, and it just creates this whole dynamic where people believe, and they come to, and in many ways rationally, if I don't join a group and protect my interests, if I mean, just to be crude, or just,
Yep.
Like if Black people get special protections and white people start to think, hey, I'm not going to get a job if I don't also have special protections, so now I have to lobby for white people protections or whatever. I mean, that's not precisely how it works, but every minority group or anybody who can consider themselves a minority then has an incentive to go and plead to a politician, I want special protections too, because why does that guy get it and I don't get it? And maybe I won't get hired if I'm not a member of a protected class. And they proliferate in absurd ways. So you talked about sexual orientation, which is predictable once you get to where we are in today's society. It's also like some age, you can't discriminate against people based on age. Military service, which was one I totally had forgotten about, which is just sort of out of nowhere. Oh, well, if we're going to protect people, we should protect people based on their military service. Just, I got nothing against people who are in the military. It's great, thanks and all that, but it's just weird. Religion is a predictable one. I mean, we're at a point now where some state laws protect people against discrimination based on their height, based on their weight. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
I can play in the NBA finally.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, you've used that, Iran, as a way to prove or show what is wrong with egalitarianism. And I know that it's like half joking, or at least it's an extreme sort of example, but sure. Hey, we're going to get there one day. I mean, that's inevitably where this goes. So you have just this proliferation of these anti-discrimination laws, and it just, like, if you play it out just a little bit more beyond where we are today, so much of what businesses are allowed to do is now dictated by the government in myriad ways. But that at a certain point, I think the businesses get to a point where they don't want to make any decisions without first asking permission of some agency or some bureaucrat. Am I allowed to do this? Please give me rules. Then you get to a point where businesses are actually saying, we want rules. We want more rules. And the reason is they don't want to operate in a legally vague and cloudy atmosphere. They want clarity, and clarity is better than chaos. Clarity is better than I make a decision. I could be not liable at all. I could be liable for a few $1,000. I could be liable for $1 billion, and I don't know what the hell to do. So I'm frozen in action. I can't take any steps to solve this. I want the federal government or the state government to tell me what I'm supposed to do. So that's just a natural progression. But
yeah. So I mean, what do we do then about private discrimination if we don't have laws, right? So, I mean, who wants to live in a world in which stores have blacks only, or whites only, or no gays, or no this, or no that, or no short people on their windows and counters and bathrooms? I mean, I visited South Africa once in I think it was 1991 or two, before apartheid went away. And it was disgusting. I mean, it was really horrific. Beaches for whites only, beaches for blacks only, bathrooms for whites, bathrooms for blacks. I mean, it was just disgusting. How do you deal with that in a free culture where you're not going to use the law to do it?
I mean, I think I would say there's a number of things. First, we have to understand that, and so some of the evidence that you pointed to before, the point you made earlier, that that this is so often exacerbated or motivated by bad government laws, and we can get restrictions on who can ride where on buses, so blacks to the back of the bus, and that sort of thing, and the law that I mentioned before that didn't allow blacks to live in certain kinds of neighborhoods. Oftentimes, the businesses are only doing that because the government is compelling them to do it, and there's plenty of evidence for that. So, and that's sort of the flip side of the point I was about to make, which is there's no incentive for rational businesses to engage in discrimination, because, to put it sort of bluntly, Black people's or minorities' money is just as good as anybody else's. Now, does that mean that you're not going to have any kind of discrimination in a free society? No, of course not. Of course you're going to have that. But over time, there's no economic incentive for it. There's an economic incentive against it. And then there's societal pressure would build to weed out, I think, and marginalize those who engaged in private discrimination. And over time, that would get solved. And I'm not convinced that it got solved any quicker than it otherwise would have if we had allowed private businesses to deal with it. And when you think about the many ways in which once you sort of educate people about how horrible racism and, let's say, sexism and other irrational discrimination is, there's a whole constellation of things that kind of kick in. So insurance companies aren't going to want to insure the racist businesses, because who wants to be associated with these kinds of people? And I'm sure you could, much more about how
banks would discriminate, in a proper way, right? But
right, that's exactly right. Banks wouldn't loan to people or to businesses, or banks, or some banks will say, hey, Black people are just as good at making money as white people. Why the hell would I pass up the opportunity to make good loans to good business people with good credit? It's completely crazy not to do that.
And if the laws were just, I don't know, I don't know if you saw the movie on Apple TV. I guess it was an Apple production called The Banker. I think it was called The Banker.
That I heard about it, but I didn't see it.
Yeah, it's worth watching, because it's based on a true story, and it's about these Black entrepreneurs, and they try to buy a bank in Texas, and no way are they going to buy a bank in Texas, even though supposedly they're legally allowed to do it, but the regulators, who are just as racist as the other people around them, figure out a way to stop them from being able to buy the bank. So racists are going to exist, but in a culture where the state does not embrace the racism, forces would build up to reduce their impact. People would leave. People would go build businesses elsewhere. But in a free society, one of the reasons they couldn't get the bank was not because nobody would bank with them, because they had black customers for the first time they could. It was because the regulators wouldn't allow it, right? So again, in a free society, think about what would happen if all the banks in town wouldn't lend to Blacks. Well, some out-of-town bank would enter and lend to all the Blacks and make lots of money. Or some Blacks would get together and start a bank and lend to each other. And you take out all those mechanisms as soon as you impose regulations on business. So this is the mixed economy encourages these kind of bad actors.
Well, you also make it worse in the sense that I don't think this is true with banks, although you would probably know this better than I would, but I'm almost positive this is true with insurance companies. So all insurance companies have to essentially be allowed to, and most businesses need some sort of regulatory approval to function or to set up and do business in a state. So if you allow that kind of regulation, which seems on its face, oh, it's there to protect the public, has nothing to do with racism, nothing to do with impure motives. Okay, what happens if an insurance company wants to branch from, I don't know, New York City to Mississippi in 1960, or a bank wants to open a branch there, and they want to start loaning to all of the Black people that the local banks won't loan to? Do you think the state of Mississippi or Alabama or whatever is going to charter or allow that bank into town when they know that they're going to push back against the racist policies? No, they're not going to do that. And it's only that regulatory authority, that authority to say, you have our permission to do business in our state, and a raft of regulations that kind of it gives the worst people power, real power, which is to say political power, over businesses that otherwise would come in and behave properly. So, one of the solutions here is we really have to unwind regulation if we want people to have the freedom to engage in good behavior. It's not so people often think about this as, oh, if we get rid of regulation, it's giving people the freedom to engage in bad behavior. Well, yes, but it's also giving people the freedom to engage in good behavior. Absolutely. And that's like totally missed. Like nobody sees that. And it's such a horrible thing that people don't understand that, because fundamentally, most people, at least in a country like the United States, they want to behave, well, they want to be moral. They want to it's not just that they're greedy, wanting to make money, although there's nothing wrong with greed, but it's that they want to treat their fellow human beings well. And having a free market and a vibrant business community breeds benevolence for the most part. And nobody sees it that way. People see it as just breeds, crass, horrible behavior. It's exactly the opposite.
So should the law have any role to play in discrimination?
Well, in a sense. So, there's two. So let me point to one obvious one, which is sexual harassment, and we can talk a little bit about that because that's slightly different than racial racism. And then another one that's a hard case that I'd actually like your views on too, because I am not entirely sure what to think about this one, but let's leave that one for the second. So sexual harassment is a bit different in that it is in its worst form, let's say, assault and battery, and really something that the law should deal with. So if let's think about what Harvey Weinstein did. The guy, I don't know. I'm not up to the exact minute of what has happened with all of his cases, but I think he settled a bunch of cases and was, I believe he was even indicted for rape, but I might be wrong about that. But whatever.
No, he has been indicted for rape.
Yeah. He is a horrible person. There's no question in my mind that guy was not just like, behaving like a dirty old man and saying, will you, participate in these acts with me? I think he was committing assault. He was almost definitely committing assault and battery and doing all kinds of things that there is such a thing as harassment in the law. And, it's not the easiest thing to define, but it's it's like a repeated effort to physically intimidate another person, or it is just an effort to physically intimidate another person. And a woman alone in a room with a man.
It strikes me as a legitimate concept. That is that if somebody's in your face constantly and you tell them, no, stop, go away, even if they're not physically assaulting you, there should be a legal mechanism to stop them doing that.
Yeah. Right? Absolutely. And assault, by the way, most people don't realize this because assault is always coupled with battery, and everybody thinks of assault as actually physically, harming somebody. But assault is sort of an attempted battery in a sense. An assault is, or the better way to think about it is, it's a threat through physical action. Assault doesn't actually require the actual physical contact, which is why assault and battery all goes together. So, if I go to take a swing at you, that's an assault. If I connect, that's a battery. So, you take away the battery part of it, just think of a man, alone in a room late at night, like standing over a woman, demanding that she give him sexual favors, that's assault, or at least it should be investigated as assault. And so that's one thing that's perfectly legitimate, no matter what context it arises, and whether it's in the privacy of your own home, in the business, whatever. And I think this is a real thing that, people need to take seriously. There's also, so the law, there are all kinds of potential contract issues that would arise in the context of either any form of discrimination. Now that would require some kind of an employment contract. So if you had an employment contract that specified certain ways that you could be fired or treated in an employment context, there's arguably, or at least conceivably, a violation of your employment contract. Now, at-will employment essentially says you can fire somebody for any reason. So I'm not quite sure. Like, I don't think the law should reach into contract, into private contracts and impose terms in a contract that are not in a contract. So I don't know, maybe not, but I do think assault and battery, whether it's civil or criminal, must play a role in mediating all human interactions, and that would apply in the employment and business context as well.
So why was that not enough? Why do we have now a slew of sexual harassment laws and all kinds of regulations and constraints?
I think, again, it gets back to, it's a couple of things. One, there was the perception, again, that real sexual harassment or odious, irrational, what we would both think of as, no, this is very bad behavior. Really, it's both what we talked about before, what would count as assault, but also just lewd and horrible behavior by men toward women. So it was a real thing. It exists. It still exists today, obviously. Again, there was a move or a distrust, I think, of private actors that they would solve these problems. Now, I don't think that's, I wouldn't put it as totally crazy or irrational in any sense, because sexual harassment really exists. I'm not a fan of the Me Too movement, but I have to say, I definitely learned some things like, well, this is way more prevalent than I realized it was, or at least it's more serious. It happens, and in a way that I just didn't realize. It's not like in my employment history, I didn't see a whole lot of what I would call sexual harassment, and so it wasn't really on my radar. But I also don't believe that all of the women who were complaining about certainly Weinstein and others were just making things up. So it's a real thing. And I think people, again, to get back to what we were talking about before, they just don't trust that this is going to be dealt with in any way through private behavior.
Part of that is that we haven't let it, as people have become more conscious of these, the first instinct is to go to government since, I think, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So we've kind of, all our problems now, we default to government to find a solution. And this is just one more of those. And, even issues of like, that are borderline where women don't like to be treated, or some women don't like to be treated in XYZ. Instead of having it, communicating that and having a conversation about that, the default is, well, let's get the government involved, or let's get the authorities involved, or let's find a legal remedy for these things.
Yeah. And I think there are two other things worth noting. One is, and this is like, I'm not sure this is true, but it's worth pondering because it makes sense that it would be true, that when you enact sexual harassment laws, you create liability for companies for a wide range of things, some of which are legitimate, perhaps legitimate in the sense that private actors should condemn this kind of behavior, not legitimate in the sense that the government should be involved in it. But once you create that kind of liability, now everybody who acts in an employment context to speak up against lewd, horrible, bad, sexual harassing kind of behavior, or just bad behavior by men, let's say, against women, now you've attached a price to it, and it becomes a much bigger issue. And it is harder for a company, I think, or individuals within a company to air that, because now they know, if we talk about this, this is going to cost the company a gazillion dollars and we can't really settle this kind of issue and figure a way to sort of purge this bad behavior, it becomes, I think there could be an adverse incentive structure that's created by making it like you could think about, we've made it into a federal case. And when you make it into a federal case, companies have an incentive to brush it under the rug, to not pay attention to it. Now, I don't know. I can't prove that's going on. I suspect that has an impact on it. So that's one point. Maybe I'm wrong about it, but it strikes me as at least something worth thinking about. Another is to just look back at what in fact happened. So sexual harassment has been illegal under federal and state law for many, many years. And yet somehow Harvey Weinstein was still able to get away with the behavior that he did. Now, a lot of people say, well, thank goodness we had these laws, or it's good that we outlaw this. But I look at that and I say, well, wait a minute. This is an example of these laws failing miserably. Now, why they failed miserably, why it is that in the Hollywood, this seems to have happened a lot in Hollywood, why it was that this kind of thing happened and was perpetuated for so long, I don't exactly know. But
there's a culture, right? And cultures have their own rules and have their own patterns of behavior. And I think culture changed, and women started speaking up and not tolerating this anymore. And that was the Me Too movement. And then they had the law to fall back on. But people and you see this even on the chat right now, right? People asking, Yaron, Steve, when are you going to go into politics? At some point you have to go into politics because and the point is that you can't achieve your goals through politics. You can't get rid of racism through politics. You can't get rid of sexual harassment through politics. You can't get laissez-faire capitalism through politics. Ultimately, you have to do it in politics, but they ultimately is so far away from where we are today because that ultimately requires a real change in culture. So the Me Too movement and the change in orientation, the way to think about this, and granted, it went too far and it's a little nuts, kind of the stuff that the Me Too do, but is far more impactful on reducing sexual harassment than anything the law can do. But as a culture now, we rely on government to do everything, and everybody wants objectivists to come to power and I guess force everybody to be laissez-faire capitalists. That'll work really well.
Right. Your point, you often make this point that politics is downstream from culture and philosophy, and it's just true. That is just a reality we have to live with. And one of the adverse consequences, one of the bad consequences of putting government in charge is that it's a way of, in a sense, taking responsibility away from all of us as individual citizens we are really ultimately in charge of this society, in the sense that, if we want something to change, we got to change ourselves and we got to change other people. And we have to convince other people to adopt better ideas. And if you think the government's going to take care of all of these things, it's a way of saying, well, I got no, I have no dog in this fight. That's somebody else's problem. Well, it's your problem and everybody else's problem. So you should think about it, and you should, at the very least, get your own sort of house in order and get your own thinking in order on that. And so this is just one more example of how regulation and this notion that government solves all our problems really has the opposite effect.
Yep.
There's one other, so another example that's worth keeping in mind here, and I think really important to keep in mind on the issue of sort of solving a problem privately and through education is, gay rights. Gay rights. You think about the gay marriage decision, the Obergefell decision. That decision was a postscript to a battle that had already been won. By the time Obergefell came down, gay marriage was already going to be a thing. Now, I think Obergefell is a kind of goofy and mixed up decision in many ways, but it doesn't ultimately matter because gay people had already won the social cultural battle.
And they won the cultural battle. That's the point. Right?
Yeah, and they did it. It's a cool history, and it's a cool thing to think about because it happened, as far as I can tell, entirely privately and through education. And not for nothing, Justice Kennedy almost definitely had gay law clerks and knew gay, you know what I mean? That the judges, I mean, this is what happens. People get to know gay people. They're like, hey, they're good people. They're just like us. Why am I treating them differently? This is stupid, and by the time that came along, yeah, are there pockets of anti-gay sentiment in this country? Yes, they are still there. But they're sort of, they've lost the historical battle, and we didn't really need the Obergefell decision. I mean, it's not quite right to say that, but leaving that aside, the cultural battle was won by then, and it wasn't done through law. It was done through education and people's attitudes changing. So that's an important point to keep in mind.
So I want to get to one more issue, and then we've got a bunch of super chat questions, and maybe we'll get some more. But I want to connect this to, and I know you have a challenge of a question that you want to ask in terms of how the government should treat. But I want to get to this question about how all this relates to what's going on the internet, issues of free speech, issues of deciding who can say what on whose platform, and all of that. Is it related? Is there common principle here?
Yeah, absolutely. In my view, it is. And it's related because there's a connection necessarily between your ideas and your actions. I mean, your actions are motivated by your ideas, and your material, your job, your earning money, all has an impact on the values that you can pursue. And so, to sum it up in Rand's terms of free mind and a free market are corollaries, right? So when we seek to control, I think it's really not possible for government to control our actions without in some way having an impact on our ideas and our thoughts and our speech. And that's even true in the criminal context, which is appropriate to control. But I mean, we can leave that aside. The bottom line is that if you tell people that they have to associate with others, if you tell them that they have to do business with other people, you necessarily are telling them that they have to put aside their differences with those people, or the fact that they find some of those people repugnant and don't want to deal with them, which has an impact necessarily on their intellectual freedom. So to take a concrete example, if somebody forced Jews to deal with Islamic terrorists who want to kill them, let's say, and let's leave aside the criminal aspect of just, you all have to get together and deal with each other, even though one of you wants to kill the other or wipe the other off the face of the planet. The Jews would have a really good argument to say, are you kidding me? Why? I don't want to associate with this person. I don't want to help this person's views. I don't want to support their views. Or, I mean, in the context of a real case that came up, which is the Masterpiece Cake Shop, it was a clash between a pretty fundamentalist religious Christian who didn't want to support gay marriage and gay people that essentially wanted to force him to bake them a wedding cake. And that really was a violation of his right of association, and I think his intellectual freedom. In other words, he has the right and should have the right to deal with whom he wants, and shouldn't be put in a position where his fundamental beliefs, even though I think they're wrong, and I don't think they're wrong just on gay issues, I think they're wrong in a lot of other ways. He shouldn't be put in a position of having to give kind of moral sanction to people he disagrees with. He should be able to disassociate with them. So if anti-discrimination laws necessarily violate the right of association, there's no way around that. You cannot, because the whole idea of association is I shouldn't be able to have to associate both. I should have freedom of association, which means I should both be able to associate with whom I want, and I should have the freedom not to associate with whom I want.
Is there a risk that anti-discrimination laws are going to be used against, like Twitter for discriminating against conservatives, and maybe some, right-wing platform, Fox, for discriminating against the left? Is it going to get into the realm of ideas?
Yeah, I think it will, and I think that I think we already see the same basic idea at work. So there is this notion now, it's right now, it's still sort of in the realm of the way people think of freedom of speech. So a cardinal aspect of freedom of speech is the government can't engage in content discrimination. And so a lot of the people who believe that social media are censoring are pointing to the fact that social media are in fact, in certain ways, engaging in content discrimination. They just are, right? But they're not a government. So if you hold the notion that discrimination as such is a bad thing, and you think that nobody should discriminate, it makes sense to criticize them because they're discriminating against you. And then the next logical step, or somewhere in that thinking, is, well, if we're not allowed to discriminate against people based on race, sex, et cetera, why should we be able to discriminate, or religion? Why should we be able to discriminate against them based on other ideas they hold? And it's true. Like if I can't purge my website, or if I'm not allowed to say I don't want to have religious content, let's say, or deal with religious people, or really anybody, but I mean, I'm choosing religion here because religion is ideas, and
Sure.
there really is an issue of intellectual freedom. Then why should I be able to discriminate against conservatives or liberals? I mean, it follows as a matter of course, and you get immediately into these fights about, well, ultimately, you shouldn't be able to discriminate against me on any basis, and kicking me off Twitter. And then if you add in the idea that businesses can't discriminate. So if I can't kick somebody out of my restaurant, everybody, the justification used to be, well, that's action, and you're, even if you're not using force against him, you're telling him he can't come out on your premises, and that's just different than speech, and we can make a distinction. Well, what if Twitter kicks me off their platform? They only exist in the virtual world, right? They only exist in the kind of realm of ideas. There's no physical space. Isn't that the same thing as kicking somebody out of your restaurant? And in fact, sorry, you want to say something, but there's one
reinforcement point. Yeah, go ahead.
So the final point is, a lot of people are pointing to both public accommodations law and common carrier laws. And I think what common carriers laws, they're basically anti-discrimination in the context of transportation typically, and it's freight transportation. It started with the railroads and it goes into trucking too. And the idea was railroads shouldn't be able to discriminate against anybody, any shippers that wanted to ship goods. And exactly the same idea is the basis of net neutrality, which is just, again, that we take that into internet service providers. And many people pointed out that, wait a minute, if net neutrality is passed, that means I don't have the freedom to decide what ideas I transmit through my cables, internet, service, et cetera. Now we've just mixed the intellectual realm and the physical realm entirely, and we're about to obliterate what I think was ultimately a false, or at least a strained distinction, and one that doesn't ultimately hold up in law once you go down this path.
No, I think it all falls apart. I mean, common carrier laws prevent AT&T from discriminating. People think that's a great idea. No, I mean, AT&T should have the right to ban me from speaking on their phone lines. I mean, it's their lines. That's what it means.
Right.
It's probably not practical for them to do so without listening into my conversations, but and for a variety of other reasons. And the same is true on streets. You should be able to tell people in a private market, certain people are not welcome on my roads. Now, there are issues about, there's always somebody will always come up, what if you own a property and somebody buys a property all around you, and how do you get to your property on and off? So there has to be some recognition in the law of access, but that's in extreme situations, not in normal times. People have a right to ban you from using their property. But I was going to say that the idea of treating a restaurant as a public space, and that's why you can't discriminate, then turns into, well, isn't Twitter the public square and you can't discriminate? And I hear that from a lot of libertarians and some objectivists and others, but it's a public square. But first of all, they shouldn't be public squares. But secondly, it's not. And any more than a restaurant is. But we ban discrimination from restaurants. So, we have to ban discrimination from Twitter.
Yeah, and what they're arguing when they say that is that it's a public forum, which is it's a sort of subset of free speech law that essentially says that if the government takes government property and opens it up as a forum, after having done that, it can't discriminate on the basis of content, which, there shouldn't be those public forums, as you and I think. But it is valid, I think, to say, look, if we're going to open a public park up for rallies or speeches or whatever, you can't make it. The government shouldn't be able to discriminate on the basis of content.
Of course, it's impossible, right? Because
I understand why that. Like, I think it makes sense that developed in free speech law, because there's really no other way. Otherwise, you are involving government in ideas. But not for nothing, we already involve government in ideas. Like, that's what public schools are. So, once you cross that line, you're eventually going to get to where we are today with those kinds of.
Inevitable. It's inevitable.
And by the way,
Jefferson endorsing the University of Virginia to where we are today.
Yeah. It's worth pointing out too that when conservatives or anybody really says that, and it's not just conservatives, the left actually has been saying the same thing about Twitter and Facebook. They're just in favor of what Twitter and Facebook are doing, or at least they. But when people say Twitter should be a public accommodation too, our response should be, you know what, a restaurant shouldn't be a public accommodation. It's a private space. It's not a public space. That's They own it, and they should be able to decide who comes in and who doesn't come in, even if they engage in really bad, choices in that respect.
So just one final question about some of this in relates to kind of what Matt was asking as well.
What do you make of the kind of, I don't know, it seems insanity of all these guidelines at businesses? And you remember in California, there was a whole wall at the Ayn Rand Institute where we had to, by law, post all the anti-discrimination, anti-this, anti-that regulations and laws that came down from the state of California. Well, nobody read them. Nobody knew what they said. And but there's a million little different things, what you can and cannot say, what you can and cannot do.
They're crazy for the reasons you point out. Nobody ever reads them, and nobody anywhere ever reads them, unless the only people I've ever seen who read those are people who are looking for a way to.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, that's, at least in my experience, maybe it's not the only people who ever read them, but those are the ones, the people who pay close attention to that. Ayn Rand made the point many times in many different ways that the best way to sort of, I'm screwing this up. You'll remember this better, but you can only control a guilty man, or one of the best ways to control a person is to make them guilty. And I mean, those regulations, or she put it in Atlas Shrugged, if we don't have enough criminals, we'll create them so that we can control them in a sense. And I think regulations like that, that can't be understood, can't be followed, are designed ultimately to do that, or at least that they have that impact. They tie businesses' hands, they tie private parties' hands. They put people in a position where they think they're guilty of some sort of an infraction, if not a crime, constantly. They're constantly subject to liability, and that makes them more pliable and easier to control. And we can see that in its worst form with Ted Cruz and I mean, it's both sides, but I think Cruz has probably been the worst. And who's the other? Josh Hawley. Calling the and it's not just them, it's everybody in Congress. The left has done this too, but these guys, I think, have been particularly bad at it, calling Mark Zuckerberg and the other tech titans, so to speak, before Congress to berate them. That's pure power mongering. I mean, we're going to intimidate you into doing what you want. And we know, and that at some point you'll be underfoot, we'll have a boot to your neck and we'll be able to then control you. And we've seen this from all across the political spectrum. So
it's just from somebody who claims to be a pro-free marketer like Ted Cruz. It's just shocking. But all right, so we got a bunch of questions. I do want to say thank you to Six Marbles. That's a very generous contribution. Thank you. I mean, we talked about this earlier, but I think it's important to note, like a lot of these bad laws, they come into being to address an issue that is real.
discrimination, harassment, just boorish, bad behavior, managers who are obnoxious. But what they do is they take away personal agency and personal responsibility and the need to leave a job or to go over your boss's head or to not go to a restaurant that is discriminating against people unjustly. And it kind of whitewashes it, and I think you're right early on. It creates an underground, and I think a lot of the racism we're seeing in the last few years is a consequence of that pent up racism that exists, and on both sides. I think the anti-discrimination laws have also emboldened Black racists to
Yes.
become even more identify themselves around race, which Martin Luther King tried to move them away from. But
right, it also it boxes people in and doesn't give them the freedom to think about creative solutions to these very real kinds of issues that can come up in the workplace or can come up in other places. So yeah, I mean, racism, sexism, those are all parts of life. They exist out there, but there are variants of them. And, businesses should have the freedom to be able to say, okay, look, this guy called that guy a horrible thing, but maybe we can solve this in a way that doesn't involve going to court over it, hiring lawyers. Maybe we can just sit down and you guys can figure out what your differences are. Maybe it was you said a stupid thing at a bad time, or this person thought that, workplace would be a great time to ask this girl out on a date. And you know what? You shouldn't really do that. Let's not turn that into a federal case. Maybe we can settle this the old-fashioned way. We all talk about it. People behave like adults. But these laws don't allow that to happen. And you're right. The agency aspect of this, I think, is something that's often forgotten. And just the freedom to solve problems in a private, out of court, not involving the rule of law or laws, it would be a huge advance.
Yeah. Okay, let's do some questions. All right, Steve, and these are going to be all over the place.
Yeah.
What's your view on bail reform? The Biden administration wants to remove cash bail for all misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies like they've done in New York. Is this an enhancement of individual rights?
I think the answer is, God, I can't remember. There's a reason that they're doing this. And there's a reason that they're removing cash bail, but I can't remember what it is. So I don't really have an easy answer to that.
I think it's to help poor people, right?
Yeah, it is. But yeah, I guess I don't have strong views of it, unfortunately. I don't.
Yeah, and particularly, a lot of these misdemeanors shouldn't be laws against a lot of these behaviors anyway. So if it's not clear that it's bad or good. If it included violent crime, then I'd clearly be against it.
Yeah.
I don't know that you can get bail for violent crime anyway, so I'm not sure that would be relevant. But it would depend on what nonviolent crimes they are. Is it a burglary or is it drug possession? Right. That would make a big difference.
I guess maybe the question, I'm not real familiar with it, but it's just doing away with bail in a misdemeanor context in general. Is that the basic idea? Yeah, no, I would be in favor of doing that. I agree with that wholeheartedly.
If it's misdemeanors, I think nonviolent crime, it depends on the type of crime it is.
Yeah.
Are current domestic violence laws completely unjust? He says men are guilty until proven innocent.
There's definitely, well, I should put it that I think there is. So first of all, domestic violence laws are not unjust. They're entirely appropriate. They're just a subset of what we were talking about before, assault, battery, violent. And not for nothing, it happens a lot in a domestic context. It's just true. I have friends who are prosecutors. I've heard about this. This is just well known and has been true for a long time. And it's really not hard to figure out why you put people in close quarters. They're married to each other. They don't like each other. There's opportunity for all kinds of horrible things to happen. So it's appropriate to have domestic violence laws, which is just a subset of laws against, assault, battery, violent crime, et cetera. Now, are they slanted against men? The laws themselves, I don't think are. My sense is that, no, I shouldn't say the laws aren't, because I think there probably are laws on the books. My sense is that in some ways the justice system sort of views men as, I don't know if I would say innocent until proven guilty, but it's sort of slanted against men.
Or guilty until proven innocent, you mean?
Or yeah, guilty until proven innocent. Sorry, I'm more used to putting it the other way. But yeah, I think that is true. But I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with domestic violence laws. It's how they're being applied. I mean, you could say, again, this is a sense that in divorce law, men often get screwed and women are, and there's reasons for that, historically reasons for that, which is not to condone it. And I could be wrong from an empirical standpoint, but that's been my sense.
Are most judges you deal with rational or emotionalist and on a vindictive power trip?
That's a hard one. I don't know if I would say most. I think there are a lot of bad judges out there, but there are still a lot of good judges. I wouldn't put it as emotionalist. I would put it as they're reflexively pro-government, and they don't spend the kind of time really thinking through the legal issues that they need to. And that is more defensible at the trial level than it is as you go up the appellate ladder. And if people don't quite get this, I mean, trial court that's the first court you go to. That's where you have actual trials. Judges have much less time to spend thinking through deep, difficult constitutional issues at the trial court level. And they all know that these things are going to be appealed up. Appellate judges have way more time and have much less excuse to issue bad decisions or ill thought out decisions. So yeah, there's a lot wrong with the judiciary. I don't know if I would call it emotionalism, although some of them are. And one of a bad trend in recent years, and it's certainly not, it's not confined to the Trump years, but it's something that I think came out with Trump, is judges kind of wearing their views of a case on their sleeve and believing that part of their job is to sort of strike a blow for what they think is moral. It's essentially, people would call it being political. I mean, I have little doubt, or I don't know if I should put it this way, but it seems pretty clear to me that a whole lot of judges, because of their antipathy for Trump, were willing to rule against the Trump administration in ways that wasn't really supported by the law. And, I think Trump was horrible. Yes, he was a bad president. All the reasons that you've talked about on your show, I agree wholeheartedly with you, Yaron. But it's bad for a judge to decide an issue because it's coming from the Trump administration or because it involves Trump or opining on how horrible people, like I saw recently a judge, or it was at least a headline in a quick news squib about a judge berating a defendant in one of the Capitol Hill attacks, or one of the defendants from the Capitol Hill attack, which ultimately, there's nothing wrong with a judge expressing a view after trial and after, at the point of, let's say, sentencing. But in the beginning of a case, before anybody has been shown to be, it's wrong to do that as a judge. And because it gives the impression that the judge is basically that it's a rigged deal, and now the judge is going to find this person guilty, or the court is going to find this person guilty before you've had a trial. Do
you find judges to be anti-business?
Yeah.
So they're suspicious of business to begin with?
What they are is conventional. So most of them are conventional. And conventional thinking is that two things. Big is bad and big business is the worst. And it's just everybody this is drilled into everybody's head from the time that they're young. So it's sort of a slant against business, or business is crass because it's commercial, or, well, businesses can afford it. And come on, they can afford it. It's not really a big deal if we treat big business especially poorly. We should be solicitous of small business and customers. And I mean, judges, especially in the law, has an extreme bias against businesses and in favor of, quote, consumers and customers. So that's just built into the law in many, many different ways. Tort law, regulatory law. So it's, I would say they're conventional in their antipathy to business.
Yeah.
I don't know that they're necessarily worse. Some of them are, but I don't know across the board that they would be.
Has the Institute for Justice been more effective than any other at getting occupational licensing laws repealed?
Not more effective than PLF. No, IJ definitely. Well, I mean, they've been really effective at it in terms of what they're doing, and I would broaden it to the many people who, for many years worked on getting rid of occupational licensing, whether it's in the courts or elsewhere. And it wasn't just IJ. IJ didn't sort of invent that area of law. They were relying on other people, but they perfected it in a way that I think nobody else did. And they have really pushed the ball forward. And then other organizations like PLF have gotten involved in that same work over the years. So yeah, I mean, they've done a lot. But here's something. This is not. Maybe I shouldn't say this because I work for one of these organizations. Maybe I'll get criticized for this. It's not at all any kind of a knock on what we refer to as public interest law. But if you think about what has been one of the giant leaps forward in the strike against occupational licensing laws, I would say it's not any legal organization. I think Uber probably has done more to strike a blow for occupational freedom than anything put together. I mean, just by toppling or at least for a certain amount of time, toppling the sort of taxi regulatory regime. And they did it they did it in such a brilliant way by creating a great product and then mustering their customers to go yell at regulators to say, how the hell can you deny us this wonderful service?
Well, so, and violating regulations, by violating the law, right?
Exactly.
So they said, hell with regulations. We're going to break the law, but by doing so, we're going to create a customer base that's going to fight them outside.
It was pure genius. I mean, Travis, I don't know if Travis Kalanick came up with this, but it was absolute genius what he and others did. I think he did because he was like he was in these hearings often rallying his customers. But it shows you that, again, I think that's kind of an example of politics being downstream from culture in the sense that there was a real cultural moment of people realizing that technology was good and helped them in their own lives, and people capitalizing on that and pushing back against or in favor of innovation and something that was seen as, Stone Age's anti-innovation. And so while I'm, obviously a huge fan of public interest organizations and strategic litigation, we need more than just that. And oftentimes it would be great if we had social movements and businesses standing up for themselves.
Absolutely.
How does an advocate of the Founding Fathers get past people who tried to dismiss their ideas because they had slaves? That comes up a lot when I try to advocate their ideas about freedom.
Yeah. If you want to chime in on this one, I can also, I have thoughts on it, and it's you have to point out, really a couple of things. One is you have to point out the context. The Founding Fathers, America did not invent slavery. It's been around literally for the entirety of human history. They inherited slavery. So it's fundamentally, I think, very much like the argument against capitalism, the argument from poverty. Well, under capitalism, workers were mistreated, people were poor in the Dickensian, olden days. Well, guess what? That was the state of humanity for all of human history. So what you have to say is compared to what? Prior to, and it's not strictly America. It wasn't just the American Revolution that got rid of slavery. It was, I would say it was the Enlightenment, and the good ideas that came to the fore during the Enlightenment. And that was perfected in a sense in the American Revolution and with the American form of government. But Britain got rid of slavery, I think, before America did, right? And they didn't, it wasn't as embedded in Britain for reasons that, I'm not entirely sure of historically. But that's where you have to start, is to say context. You have to establish the context, and you just have to point out that these ideas are universal. The idea of human freedom and rights is precisely what the slaves were fighting for.
Yep.
And Frederick Douglass made these points so eloquently. So if you want to know how to rebut those arguments, read Frederick Douglass. like I'll say that 10 times over. If you want to read any book, like read everything that Frederick Douglass wrote. There are other thinkers too, but he was brilliant on that. And he pointed to Lincoln. He pointed to the founders and the Declaration of Independence as the ideal. He was, I think, the best commentator about slavery and the founding of the Republic, or one of the best, that I've ever read. So, looking at his arguments is a great way to think about how to frame these things.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have other thoughts, though. I'm always interested in your thoughts on this kind of thing too. But
I mean, I think there are a few things. I think, I agree completely with what you said. I mean, you've got to focus it on their achievements. And did they make a mistake? Yeah. Is there a real moral failing at the founding of the country? Absolutely. And you have to acknowledge that. But does that wipe out anything good that was done? No, of course not. And in the end, the good outweighs the bad, because the good makes possible the eradication of slavery in that, and it makes possible a free country, and it makes possible everything that we have today. So you can't throw out the good, because there was some bad stuff, and not all the founding fathers were equally good, and some of them had some bad ideas. Just like I said, Thomas Jefferson endorsed the University of Virginia. It turned out to be a horrible idea. And it done a huge amount of damage. But are we going to say because of that everything Thomas Jefferson did is worthless? That would be absurd. The second is to orient the conversation around ideas rather than on people. Right? It's not about it's important to have the founding fathers, hold them as heroes, but that's not what we're gonna really fight over. It's about the ideas, and if you can, to the extent that you can separate the person from the ideas, it's worth emphasizing the ideas that were involved in the founding of the country, the ideas that the founders held. That's what made this country what it is. So I think orienting the discussion around ideas is important. But I think you have to acknowledge, look, some of them freed slaves, some of them didn't, some of them rationalized not freeing them. They sound like rationalizations to me. They don't sound real. There is an historical context. There was reason for some of them not to release their slaves, maybe. But the whole thing, the whole compromise is a big moral political compromise that 600,000 Americans died to correct. Yeah, the founding fathers are to blame. Maybe they should have argued with the Southerners even more. Maybe they should have insisted even more. Who knows, right? It's harder, but it's not blameless.
Yeah, but at the same time, and I don't want to get into too much of a discussion on this. The two things. One, dealing with, it's not just slavery, but getting rid of the racism that existed at the time is something that just takes time. It does take generations, and it's not an easy, it's like, it's really easy to look back and say, oh, well, we're not racist today, therefore why wasn't everybody the same as we are today? But I have to say, one thing I've struggled with is, if you were there at the time, and I know this is kind of a silly, you can't really think about it like this, but if you think about the best founders, it seems to me, based on everything I've read, is they were really facing a choice between, we're either going to have a constitution and a union, or we're not going to have one at all.
I think that's right.
If we don't have that, we're going to get picked off by Spain, France, and England. And this country is going to become fractured. No. So at the time, did it not make sense for them to make that, yes, horrible compromise, but a compromise that, if it weren't made, things, probably America, or at least there's a good argument, as far as I can tell, that America doesn't exist. And
sure. But then they let it go on for 60 years without challenging it. And they were afraid of a civil war, but of course they got a civil war anyway. So yes, no, I agree completely. But Jefferson and Adams could have kept fighting against slavery in the decades following. When they were presidents, they could have done something about it, or tried at least.
Right.
Now, I'm not, again, it's impossible to put yourself in their shoes. And you're right, racism takes a long time to eradicate, just like any irrationality. I did a whole show a while back about how, look, the world's not ready for us. It's just not. It's not our time.
you know, and I know my audience doesn't want to hear it, but it's just, it takes a while for ideas to change. It takes a long time for ideas to change. And the culture has to change. It doesn't happen because a philosopher says so. It happens because these ideas creep into the culture and start to influence the way, particularly if you're revolutionary, you know, the Enlightenment happens, was it 400 years after Thomas Aquinas discovers Aristotle? It wasn't like, here's Aristotle, let's be enlightened. It takes a long time, and it takes arts and science, and it takes a million different aspects of a culture to change before even ideas change. I mean, it's a very complex structure, and racism was deeply embedded in the fabric of much of Western society. Still is, unfortunately. You go to, I mean, Europeans like to view themselves as kind of look down their nose at Americans, though, those barbarians, the racists. You know, you should see how, like, African football players were treated on the soccer pitch in France and in places like that, particularly 20 years ago. I mean, less so today because now they dominate the sport. But 20 years ago, and the things they were called and the way they were behaved, it's tribalism is part of human culture. It's deeply ingrained, and it's going to take a long time to get rid of it. And racism is just one aspect of tribalism.
Yeah.
And there are no shortcuts, unfortunately. And that's partially, we learned that from the Civil Rights Act, right? That was an attempt at a shortcut. Right. Let's use force to make a shortcut and get rid of racism faster. How's that worked out, right? Here we are in 2021, still talking about racism. It's increasing, not decreasing. And it's a real issue.
Yeah.
All right. We still got a lot of super chats. If you have to go, let me know, but
I'm good.
Okay, good. I know of employers who have Black, Latino, gay, etc. employee groups, but having a white one is not even allowed to be discussed or questioned.
What do I think of that? I mean,
I've thought about it. Why would anybody want to belong to a white?
Exactly. That's my view. And this, you see this, so this is a real error. So let's maybe broaden it beyond just that comment or what we think of that, because I think both sides of that are kind of dumb, and no one should belong to a whatever race-based group in an employment context is weird, and although it's kind of predictable in the same way that pressure group warfare is predictable in all forms of tribalism. But what was I going to say? So so the issue, so what I was going to point to is oftentimes the response by, and I typically see this among conservatives, is, well, okay, if we're going to have affirmative action for Black people, we have to have affirmative action for white people or other groups. And then there's a lawsuit going on. It was dismissed, but it's continuing. There's one at Harvard and one at Yale. And it's, now, I don't want to say that's totally wrong and it's predictable, but I think it's a mistake, which is essentially groups, and I know that there are some conservative groups involved in this, suing Harvard and Yale for discrimination against Asian people. And the argument, so I get it, like it makes sense if they are actually discriminating against Asians, and inevitably it will happen. You just can't allow that. But oftentimes this is sort of a lead into the broader point that oftentimes what we see people doing is saying, okay, well, if there's special protections for minorities, then we want special protections for white people too. And the right answer is we need to move in the opposite direction of all of this. It's let's get rid of all of these non-essential categories and groups, and not try to fight a war of all against all, or something that leads to kind of mutually assured destruction, where we just continue down the path of more and more legal protections or lawsuits against let's put it, legal protections for certain groups, and exacerbating that. And so this strikes me as that kind of a thing. If there's a group for Latino, gay, et cetera, there should be a group for white people. No, let's go in the opposite direction and try to persuade people not to do either of those things.
Yeah, although, you know, and here I'm going to be accused of being anti-white, but which I am regularly anyway. You know, I can understand why, let's say, a gay group forms, right? Here's a group that's being discriminated privately, you know, for years, and they're still a little outcast, and they want to get together to talk about their experiences with regard to that, and they have something in common that they don't have with others, that the others make a big deal of, right? And so I can see why they would want to, and particularly when they were fighting for equal rights and for the ability to marry and all of that, there certainly was a reason for them to organize together and to have clubs. And to some extent, you could argue that minority groups have some, you know, shared experiences around the fact that the majority group, which typically is white, you know, views them as differently or discriminates against them, and therefore they want to. Now, I think ultimately that just perpetuates the problem. And ultimately the ideal is colorblindness. The ideal is to get rid of all of that. But it's certainly understandable. Whereas form a group around the majority that shares nothing in common other than truly skin color. There's no experience other than maybe being the discriminator. It strikes me as just silly and a way to perpetuate kind of racial distinctions. Whereas it's not always the case that the Black and Hispanic group are there to perpetuate the racial. It's around these other issues that involve. Although that's changed, of course, with the critical race theory and the anti-racist movements. That they have become the big racists in the world today, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's true. But you make an excellent point, which is the first thing in evaluating these kinds of things would be to ask, why is the group that you're angry with or opposed to, or you're just uncomfortable with, why are they meeting in the first place? And maybe they have perfectly legitimate reasons for that. And yeah, being a kind of, I don't know, a group. Well, first of all, people want to associate with others who have shared experiences. Not for nothing, every summer we get together at Objectivist Conference. So, you know, that's not really surprising, right? Because we want to be around people who share experiences, values, whatever. And I mean,
and it's sad that skin color defines experiences.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's sad.
But something like homosexuality, I mean, that's a behavior, and that does make sense. I mean, it makes perfectly good sense that
it's the dating pool. I mean,
yeah, well, I mean, it makes sense that there were gay bars, and I mean, I guess there still are, but I mean, it was a bigger deal sort of in the time that gays were sort of in the closet, so to speak, and it makes perfectly good sense. It's you know, and yet, so to create a heterosexual only would be like, I don't know, I guess that's what all bars are. Why would you do that?
Everybody is. Yeah, exactly. So Peikoff said in his podcast that it's rational for a taxi cab driver to avoid dangerous Black neighborhoods. Is that racism?
I don't think that's racism. No, I don't think it is. I mean, not at all. In fact, from the standpoint of like what we're talking about is, yeah, I don't think that's racism.
It's the dangerous part, right?
Yeah.
That you qualify. If the taxi driver just avoids Black neighborhoods, disregarding the dangerous part, and embraces white dangerous neighborhoods, then yeah, he's a racist. But if he's just avoiding them because they're dangerous, then absolutely, that's fine. There's nothing.
Yeah, and there's a point. If we were ever really going to have a serious conversation about race in this country, that kind of thing would have to be, you know what, we really have to grapple with. Anybody who lives in a city knows that there are certain neighborhoods that are dangerous. Now, if you looked at across all American cities, I think it probably wouldn't track on racial lines, but it's also true that there are correlations between those things. And we just have to like grapple with it and say, okay, well, what's going on here? We got to be able to talk about this. We got to be able to recognize, because people on the street actually get it. And I mean, that's a really complicated issue. And it definitely doesn't, it's not like white people only avoid the Black neighborhoods. I have lots of Black friends who will say, you know, I won't go to that neighborhood either. It's dangerous as hell. It fundamentally comes down to what people associate with danger. But when when you have to make a split decision as a cab driver, or if you're walking on the street, there are all kinds of decisions and assumptions, and even, focusing on things that would be stereotypes, that a person in a pinch is just going to make decisions like that based on what they think is going to keep
And
them.
look, the statistics bear it out. The
Yeah.
fact is that blacks commit crimes disproportionately to whites. So if there's a question, you go with the probabilities and you get out of there, right? So and why that is an important question to ask. It's an important thing to solve. And if you can't talk about it, then you can't solve it. You can't deal with it. And of course, are you part of this new platform, this new, what do they call it? This new social media thing that everybody's talking about?
Probably not, because I'm a late adapter on everything like this.
It's called the Clubhouse. You're not in Clubhouse yet? Oh yeah, well, you're way behind the times, because this is like 3 days old, and it's the hottest thing on the internet right now. I mean, all the top people are on it, like all the Silicon Valley people. Anyway, I was in a Clubhouse chat thing. It's where people talk. It's all done through the phone. You talk to one another. And this woman was like on there, and it was like every problem in the world was a consequence of colonialism, right? And when you do that, you basically are not open to solving problems. You're not, and that's what the anti-racist, this new term, that's what they do. They blame everything on racism, everything on colonialism, everything on history. They take no personal responsibility, no cultural responsibility. But the culture within Black communities is screwed up. Now, you could argue it's screwed up because of Jim Crow and because of slavery, but that was a long time ago. Grow up, get a spine, and change your culture, change it within. And I don't blame the people in these neighborhoods. I blame the Black intellectuals. I blame the Black politicians. I blame the Black preachers. I blame the people who have inculcated a victimhood mentality into people. And it's tragic. It's unbelievably tragic.
Yeah. And another thing to blame is, how should I put this? It's like anti-poverty programs that go all the way back to the turn of the century, a lot of which end up with housing projects. And I mean, we have at least 2 periods in the 20th century, we had massive slum clearance and housing projects. And basically all it did was it concentrated, the poorest people in society in crappy housing that just created like a victimhood mentality, a dependence mentality. And I think has a whole lot to do with cultural, like when you think about problems in, let's say, Black culture or minority culture, a lot of it has to do with the fact that, these poverty and housing programs just created generations of people who were dependent on others and on government. And then that breeds resentment and just creates this whole, like a horrible feedback loop of,
yeah. And let's not give a free pass to the racists out there, because they are racist, and they're to blame as well. And plenty of racist government policies.
And a lot of those policies, I think, were, if not driven by racism, tinged by racism. It was both. We want to solve poverty, and we also want to make sure we crowd all the bad people into certain areas and neighborhoods. And it's horrible.
Seems to me employers are contributing to an issue that they shouldn't even be involved in. I'm not sure what that means. All right. What areas are most ripe for legal reform to counter critical legal theory, abuses, etc.? If lawyers are allowed to say there's room for reform.
We're allowed to say there's room for reform. That's a hard one. What areas? I would say probably affirmative action and all the kind of race-based programs that we're talking about now.
You think they are? They are ripe for legal reform in a sense?
Do I think they're ripe for legal reform?
Yeah, that's the question is what's the most ripe for legal reform?
What's right?
When can we make the most progress?
I mean, so I took that to mean what is the area that is most important for legal reform if you want to push back against critical race theory, or the area in which, let me put it a different way.
Critical legal theory.
Yeah, but it's critical race, critical legal. It's all sort of one Marxist-inspired bunch of crap, basically. But or it's kind of.
I mean, that's even insulting to Marx.
Yeah, probably. But anyway, but that's the area that I can think of that is most informed and influenced by critical legal theory is race-based policies in the law. I mean, higher education is, of course, heavily influenced by it, and what's going on in colleges these days, and the culture of sensitivity, trigger warnings, all of that stuff, I think is an offshoot of, or at least is heavily influenced by this. I can't think of any other area of law off the top of my head, but I would say I don't know if it's ripe for change. It's an area that needs to be changed. And if we really want to deal with tribalism and racism in this country, we absolutely, positively have to deal with, there are race-based laws or racist laws now that are, so the way I often think about this is there's never been a time in American history where we haven't had race-based / racist laws. Never.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what we did in the 1960s is we flipped from this is kind of oversimplifying, but it was flipped from anti-Black laws to sort of pro-Black laws. And they're both mistaken and both bad. And they both perpetuate a system of not only race-based policies, but they promote tribalism, and they ultimately corrode the rule of law. So we got to get rid of that. We have to fix that.
So Frank asks, isn't the hidden premise of discrimination law, I assume, that the individual is not a self-owner? He's owned by the state in a sense, so owned by.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I don't know. Like I don't tend to think of it that way, but I think that's got to be part of it. Yeah, it's not just that they're owned by the state, but that, yes. So the way I think maybe this is what the question is getting at, but it's two things. It's one, it's you're owned by the state, and two, something you talked about before is you don't have agency. You don't have moral agency, and you don't really have the ability to choose. And I think it's ultimately, but I would defer to you on this because you're better at philosophical things than I am. It's determinism, fundamentally is part of that, because what it ultimately says is race is in some way determinative or definitive, or it's at least based on that sort of background perspective. But I don't know, you probably have a better way of putting it than I do. We're getting more into philosophy, and you're better at that than I am. But
first I'd say I'm not a big fan of the term self-ownership. I don't like that term. Ownership is a characteristic of individuals. Individuals own things. It doesn't really mean anything to say you own yourself. It empties the concept of ownership from really content. It's a very libertarian term. It's an Rothbardian term, which I don't like. But yes, all of these are consequences of collectivism, and collectivism is often is a product of determinism. And if you're determined by your genes, then everybody who has similar genes is of color skin says something about all your other genes. But put that aside, somehow your tribe is that you should all act together and you should stick together because you can't make choices as an individual anyway. So it is a repudiation of individualism. It's also a repudiation of reason. You can't make choices for yourself. You can't think for yourself. And it is a kind of philosopher king. We think that you're better off if you don't discriminate, right? And therefore and that's how they voice it. They say it. We're trying to, the only way to make the world a better place is from the top down, right? The philosopher king to dictate. And yeah, some people can think, and some people can't take care of themselves, and some people do cause themselves moral damage by being racists. But what these laws are trying to do is protect them from themselves, and that's exactly what laws shouldn't be trying to do. Protect ourselves. We are agents, and we need to suffer the consequences of our bad actions, even if the bad actions impact other people. As long as we don't use force against them, just the law shouldn't protect us from ourselves. All right. Companies often settle discrimination suits because of bad publicity and the law's subjectivity. Guilt should not be assumed because of settlement. Is that true?
No, yeah, definitely not. It is not assumed because of, Yeah, I mean, it's not supposed to be. So it's not, but as a legal principle, settlement doesn't imply guilt.
Just want to recommend Steve's 2016 book, Defending Free Speech, with additional articles by Anka Gate, Ilan Jono, and Lena Peikoff. So absolutely. I don't know where you can get the book. I guess in the Ayn Rand Institute, certainly.
Yeah,
Is it on Amazon? It's on Amazon.
That has it. They'll probably give it away. So, maybe call them up and ask them for a copy. I probably have like 10 copies. So, if you need a copy, I can send it to you.
Great. What about sexual harassment in business and at higher education, where it seems like the male is presumed guilty until innocent? How to evaluate this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the same, I guess I would put it that, let me think about this. So the laws are written in such a way that it almost, I don't know if it's quite that men are presumed guilty, but that there is a sort of presumption of harassment. Now, I mean,
but there's also the case like Kavanaugh, where you just assume that the woman is right and the man is wrong, right?
Yeah, no question about that. I mean, that's out there in society, definitely. And this is one of the things that I think is wrong with the Me Too movement. And I don't like the Me Too movement at all as a movement, in the same way that I think Black Lives Matter as a sort of organization movement is corrupt. It doesn't mean that they didn't have valid complaints about things. And certainly women have valid complaints about things, but I think the Me Too movement is a sort of cultural, philosophical movement that's basically wrong in a lot of ways. But, and so that's really taken off after Me Too, but it's always, I think, sort of been in the air, so to speak.
I think college campuses, isn't there like a big bias against men on college campuses?
Yeah, that is true. Yes, that is definitely true on college campuses. What I was going to say about sexual harassment law is that, given the way it functions, that there's such a thing as hostile environment, both racist and sexual harassment in both contexts, and it's essentially the same thing as deciding that discrimination is happening statistically. Now, it's not precisely that. So it's not quite as bad in employment law as it is in, say, affirmative action law, where you look at statistics to determine disparate impact, which I think is really bogus and just, you can't, it's like correlation is not causation. So that's a mistake. But that, my sense is, and I'm not enough of an expert about this to know if this is actually true, but my sense is that's almost inherently slanted in favor of a finding of sexual harassment. And in fact, in practice, companies, anytime they're accused of that, or many times when they're accused of that, they'll just concede and, settle, and because they think they're going to lose. So maybe that answers the question. But
what do you make of airline discrimination, wherein certain airlines charge morbidly obese people for 2 airline seats because they literally took up 2 seats? Is this an immoral business practice?
I don't think it is. I think it's just a necessary business practice. It just is. Like,
they take up 2 seats.
Yeah, I mean, like if you're a parent and you have a kid, you have the choice of either putting the kid on your lap or buying a seat for the kid, and depending on how old they are. And if you put the kid in an extra seat, you should pay for it. That's rational discrimination. What we talked about before. It is what it is. Like, if there are, isn't it true that certain people are like too tall for, maybe it's not airplanes, but I mean, there are contexts in which super tall people just can't go into some places, and that just is what it is. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sure there'll be a law to protect them.
Right.
Would you ever, does Steve have any views on the Foreign Corruption Practices Act? It has been increasingly used by government to harass companies.
My sense of it is that it is a serious problem, and that there's something going wrong with it, or it's being used improperly. I don't know a ton about it, but.
So is it right for a government to say it's illegal for you to bribe a government official in another country?
I think, I don't know, that's a tough one, because I guess I would put it like this. It strikes me, and I haven't put a ton of thought into this, that it is at least not wrong for a government to say, it's illegal for you to violate the legitimate laws in another country, right? So but I don't know. I'm not sure about that. Maybe the United States should just say whatever happens in France happens in France.
I mean, what if the only way to do business in France is to bribe people?
Yeah, no, that's
Why would the American government intervene?
I mean, that is just true, right? It's not France, or I don't know, maybe it is France, but you would know. You're way more.
It's not in France. There's certainly, in certain third world countries, you can't get.
Either way, like an oil company or any of these companies can do business in other countries without bribing officials. It's absolutely positively impossible. And I'm pretty sure that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is being used to prosecute companies for that. And I think that's wrong. And I don't think not only should our government not make it illegal, it should, if it's going to do anything, it should work to try to make a safe business environment for companies. But it probably shouldn't even be doing that. It's just say, hey, this is the way it works. There's nothing you can do about it, deal with it. But we're certainly not going to prosecute you for it.
So here's a question. I don't know how to answer this. In each of your opinions, what racist group is truly the worst of all in our current time?
I mean, if you talk about, I don't know, because I don't know what all the different groups are. I know that there are white supremacists out there of various types. And it strikes me that the Proud Boys and a lot of these other crazy alt-right, or whatever you even call them now, although I might be wrong about this, and you probably know more.
I think what they're really looking for is, do you think black racism is worse than white racism, or the other way around?
I think they're both. I think you can put that in. So I'll put it in two different ways. One, they're both really bad, and they're both prevalent.
And they feed off of each other. They make each other worse.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've often thought that if you look at it from the standpoint of which side is kind of going to get away with what they're doing in today's world, it strikes me that black racist groups are going to get away with it, and therefore they're more dangerous. I've thought that more about Antifa, and I mean, I guess BLM too, although I want to make sure that I'm I don't know a ton about Black Lives Matter as an organization, but there's definitely racists within that orbit, and people who are just trying to destroy society, and it's horrible. And I think terrorist groups, people who should be considered terrorist groups in the same way that the Capitol attacks were. But I tend to view, just from a societal standpoint, that those groups that are whether you want to say they're on the left or just sympathetic to the left, are going to get away with it more than groups that are white supremacists or on the right, because of the intellectual climate today. But I'm not sure I'm right about that. I would say they're ultimately both bad.
They're both bad. They both make each other worse. And to pick and choose is a waste of time.
Right.
All right. Cheap, reliable machine power, fossil fuels, enabled the abolition of forced human labor, slavery. Renewable energy threatens to make cheap, reliable machine power impossible. Could this make us revert to tribalism and slavery? Wow, there's so much wrong with that question. Just historically, it's wrong, because slavery was abolished by the British in 1800 something, or very, very early. And the slave trade was abolished by 1812. There was no slave trade. So the British abolished slaves way before oil was discovered, if you will, or the use of oil was discovered. So slavery was gone from much of the world, at least the Western world, before that. And the reason that it went had nothing to do with machine labor, because there were no machines, or very few machines, and certainly not ones driven by fossil fuel. So it's a wrong view of history. It's a view of history that relies, it's a materialist kind of Marxist view of history, that it's how labor is deployed determines, the shape of the future. No, it's attitudes towards freedom and liberty and individual rights that shape these things. And so, no, I have no concern about alternative energies bringing us tribalism. I'm concerned about tribalism, and I'm concerned about alternative energies, but I'm not concerned about the causal relationship between the two. I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
No, I got nothing else to say. I agree.
All right. I think this is the last question. Yes. it seems as if clerical church figures have some mechanism to circumvent legal punishment when they commit child abuse, sexual harassment. Thoughts?
What's the, I was going to say, watch the movie Spotlight. Is that what it's called?
Spotlight's excellent. Yep. Yeah.
I mean, part of the reason I say that is, so I can't think of anything in the law that protects them. I don't think that religious liberty plays any role in that, but I could be wrong about that. A lot of what I know is just what I've read and then watching the movie Spotlight. And it hit me, or watching that, you get the strong sense that part of that was just the culture of Boston at the time, and the fact that it is a very sort of, in many ways, tight-knit Catholic community. And then you have the whole issue of sort of, it's a kind of circling the wagons phenomenon in which people seek to protect their own for a whole host of reasons that are, you'd have to untangle it psychologically and socially, but that strikes me as more what was going on with the Catholic priests, but I'm not.
But there is a certain deference to religion. Yeah. And I think the law, maybe not explicitly, but I think implicitly, the police are less likely to go after a priest than they are to go after just a guy on the corner who's doing child pornography. Yeah. It's the general deference to religion that exists in a culture. And in Boston, a very Catholic city, where everybody went to church and everybody had their favorite Catholic priest. They just circled the wagons, as Steve said. Yeah. So there is another element, and that is that there is a political entity to protect these people, and that is the Vatican. And a lot of these priests escaped to the Vatican and were never, the Vatican never handed them over to civil authorities to be prosecuted. The Vatican protected their own. So they have their own mechanisms. They claim to have their own courts and tribunals. And there is way too much deference to them. Yeah. All right, we just got another one. I've heard the argument that the abolition of slavery actually fostered the conditions for labor-saving devices. No. Again, slavery is inefficient. Slavery is not an economic phenomenon. Slaves did not work very hard. They weren't incredibly productive. Indeed, if you paid labor to pick the cotton, probably more cotton would have been picked. So slavery is not about economic transactions. Indeed, slavery was inefficient. I've heard libertarians, and I think they're right, even though I don't like the argument, saying slavery would have gone away even without the Civil War for purely economic reasons. The fact is that slavery is inefficient economically, and they couldn't compete with other farms where labor was actually free. Now, I'm not sure I buy that. But again, slavery was never an economic phenomenon. It was never driven by. Now, mercantilists thought it was, but that was an economic fallacy. And the fact that the North was so much richer than the South is I think, one of the illustrations of that. All right. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
It's 2 hours, solid 2 hours.
Yeah.
Good. That's good. That was great. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I will be, let's see, today's Monday. So I'll have a show on Wednesday. Remind you before you leave to like the show, if you liked it, right? Also share the show. That's how we grow this audience. And don't forget to support the show. If you want more shows like this, if you want me to keep doing this, pay me. Value for value, right? If you get value, express that in providing a value back. You could do that. YaronBrookShow.com/support. You can do it on Patreon, Subscribestar, and Locals. And of course, thank you to all the super chatters who contributed both great questions and contributed funds for the show. Thanks, Steve. We should do this again, and we should chat sometime just for fun.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool.
All right.
Bye, everybody.